At the outset, I would like to offer my humble pranams at the lotus feet of our most beloved Bhagwan. Distinguished guests and delegates to this conference, I greet you all, and also I would like to thank Professor Balachandran for inviting me to give this talk. From the introduction that was just given, which I did not hear because they were busy fitting me with this microphone, mercifully I must say, you must have come to the conclusion that I am a person with no credibility or credentials to be here. I will agree with you, especially because the subject of my talk is market, money and morality. I have nothing to do with market, I have no money, and there are some who may question whether I have any morals. But that is known to God and me, so I will not go into that. Now, while most people would say that market and money are bonded in marriage for eternity, in the present climate, hardly anyone would concede that the market has any relationship whatsoever with morality. On this issue, I beg to differ, and my task in the time allotted to me is to convince you about the existence of such a relationship. My oral presentation would be a condensed version of a slightly longer article, which has many quotes and so forth, a copy of which would be handed over to the organizers, and those who wish to have a copy are requested to approach Professor Balachandran. Okay, let me now get down to business. The term economics is normally applied to the subject that deals with production, distribution and the consumption of goods and services. At one level, economics involves individuals, obviously, but at a different level, it involves entire communities, large social institutions like banks, for example, countries, and even an entire group of countries, as in the case of the Eurozone. Understandably, the nature of the subject has evolved in time, particularly in the last century, thanks to the strong influence of science and technology. In this talk, I wish to comment on some aspects of the role played by science and technology, and also draw attention to how humanity as a whole has now reached a crossroad in history. Hard and crucial choices would soon have to be made based on factors that go far beyond traditional economics. This fact is hardly appreciated, which is the reason why I have chosen to speak on this topic. My focus would largely be on A, how we got to where we are now, and B, how we should proceed ahead if we do not wish to substantially damage or even destroy the very fabric of human society and humanness. I shall begin my narrative from August 1945, when World War II ended. I can speak with some personal knowledge because I have lived through that war. As you know, the Allies, meaning America, Britain, USSR, and to a lesser extent France, the Allies won the war. Barring America, Britain, both of which did not face invasion, and the USSR, which faced limited but brutal invasion on its western frontier, all the other countries involved in the war were almost in ruins at the end of the war, including the losers, namely Germany, Japan, and Italy. Among the victors, America stood tall, not only because of its industry, which supplied most of the hardware used for fighting the war. They gave a lot of hardware even to Russians, that was called Lend-Lease. But also because America possessed the atom bomb, which no other country had then. With Europe literally in ruins, America saw the opportunity to rebuild Europe and formulated a plan called the Marshall Plan that was drafted by George Marshall, then Secretary of State for America. He was serving President Truman. The Marshall Plan was launched in 1948 and it was completed in 1952. And in 4 short years, it enabled Europe not only to get back on its feet, but also recover very well. Even Germany, that is to say West Germany, benefited from the Marshall Plan. Most important of all, every country that received aid under the Marshall Plan was able to completely rebuild its infrastructure, which had all been destroyed during the war, which then became state of the art. And that had a big say in the rapid recovery The only country that was left out in this infrastructure rejuvenation was Britain, whose roads and bridges were not bombed. And so they continued their ancient 100-year-old roads and bridges for long after Germany had fantastic autobahns. Let me now move fast forward to the mid-70s. Thanks to the rapid strides made by many countries, America slowly began to feel the pressure of competition in the production and supply of non-military items, particularly from the Asian tigers, starting with Japan and Taiwan, and followed later by South Korea, and of course the giant China. All of them managed to nibble away most of the manufacturing might of America in crucial areas like steel production, auto manufacture, and electronic consumer goods. Soon there came a stage where, except for military hardware and space technology related items, America as a manufacturing giant became largely a thing of the past. Instead, it now began to import almost all consumer goods, from pencils and screwdrivers to shoes and underwear. To make up for this loss, America invented a new industry called the finance industry, and the circumstances leading to the creation of this new industry form the next part of my narrative. Around the same time, I'm now talking of the mid-70s, capitalism swung to the extreme right, with the laissez-faire policy of an earlier era being reinvented and rebranded by Ronald Reagan in America and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. This drastic change in market philosophy is an important landmark. Laissez-faire was not exactly an unknown concept. In fact, it had been tried earlier and also given up. But in its new incarnation, it had two major allies, namely technology and money power. Of these, money power was far more important since it could easily buy political power. And thanks to this alliance, several things started happening in America. Firstly, there was a flood of deregulation that gave a free hand to corporations, allowing them to proliferate and offer, as used to be said, more choice to the consumer. This is a magic phrase that is used by marketeers all the time. This was particularly noticeable in America in the airline industry, where numerous low-cost airlines suddenly sprang up from nowhere, allowing people who had never before traveled by air to fly regularly as if they were taking the town bus. Actually, in America, they have very few of town bus, but we have them and Europe has them. And that is how the number of air travelers shot up dramatically. And even as companies proliferated and offered a host of goods and services at competitive prices, the public was relentlessly encouraged to buy and consume as if there was no tomorrow. Earlier, every fellow keep up with the Jones. Now he had to be 2 steps ahead of the Jones. And as the advertisement constantly reminded them, the neighbor's envy was the owner's pride. We all know that, don't we? It did not matter if people had no cash on hand or had even lost their job. And this is a very important point. All that was needed was a piece of plastic called the credit card. This attitude was a sea change from earlier times when people did not borrow to buy consumer goods, go out for dinner, or on a holiday. I have lived in America of those times. It was very different. It was that change in social and moral outlook that led to a massive economic crash later. Getting back to what I was saying, all the so-called progress during the 70s to 90s period was nothing but a gateway to the famous slippery slope. At first, thanks to new laws, corporations could be legally unfair in 1,000 different ways, all of which benefited the companies while ripping off the consumer. Now here is a typical example. Let us say there is a person in California who has a credit card. His bill will be posted from a small village in New York at 5 p.m. on the evening of the last date. They would have legally fulfilled the commitment to have posted it before the due date. It will take 6 days for that bill to travel to California and be delivered to the customer. And by that time, the due date would have been exceeded by several days, as a result of which the customer would automatically be charged higher rates. Was this fair? Absolutely not. Was the company within its rights to do such a thing? You bet it was. The laws had been modified to allow for such legal swindles. As was only to be expected, it was not long before legal swindle morphed into downright fraud on a massive scale. All those who are fiercely loyal to the no-holds-barred brand of free market capitalism, and there are many all over the world, they would not be prepared to admit what I am saying, even though there is enough documentation available from investigative reporters and scholars that clearly points to massive malpractice in the housing and financial industries. And as all of you know, both of them together dragged America into a deep recession in 2008, which is only slightly better than the 1930 depression. Now, I am not making all this up. A very good analysis of the background to the developments I have just cited have been given by Professor Robert Reich of UC Berkeley in his book Super Capitalism. Robert Reich used to be the labor secretary in the Clinton administration, and he has held many academic and administration posts earlier. Now, Professor Reich's point is simple. Every individual has in him two aspects, the noble and the selfish. It's like the good wolf and the bad wolf, as philosophers say. While the noble aspect evokes communitarian spirit, the selfish aspect stimulates greed. Reich illustrates the point in a simple way. He says that in his classes, he always conducts polls about what students do, what they buy, where they travel, how they travel, and so on and so forth. He adds that when it came to buying consumer goods, all his students headed to the Walmart, very famous in recent times because of its attempt to enter this country. All of them headed to the Walmart because it offered the lowest prices. However, during discussions in the class, most students suddenly became leftists and would severely criticize Walmart for paying very low wages and importing goods from China instead of supporting American labor. In short, says Professor Reich, the average citizen developed a split personality. Where low prices were concerned, he was all for deregulation, but when it came to low wages, workloads, etc., he cried foul, charging the corporation with greed. Professor Reich points out that the individual and corporations were both driven by greed. However, the game was so set up that while the masses overconsumed and got into debt, the corporations made huge profits. Well, that's what they did in Las Vegas, but now the whole of market became one big Las Vegas. Of course, the corporations were not without their problems. Earlier, there were only a few, and they had a sort of cartel which rigged the prices. But now, says Reich, there were many companies, and there was huge competition, and they all lobbied separately with Congress to get laws favorable to them. You see this particularly in the information industry, where the industry is divided into two segments. On one side are the content providers, generators like Hollywood and television studios. And on the other side are the service providers, internet companies that allow you to go on the net and see movies and things like that, Netflix and so on. There is always a clash of interest, and the way the rules change depends on who lobbies and how the laws are twisted from time to time. Incidentally, I must mention that the market also did not escape the consequences of greed, because the law of karma applies to all, whether you like it or not. But that story comes later. Now, the transition to laissez-faire, that is from a system in which capitalism and democracy worked in harmony to a system in which capitalism started exploiting democracy, did not happen as if by accident. On the contrary, as early as 1960, President Eisenhower clearly foresaw how powerful corporations using money power could make the legislative bodies their tool and subvert to democracy. In fact, he made this remark in his farewell speech to America on the eve of his retirement. And he described in detail how the military industry, namely the people who make like Boeing, Lockheed and all that, how they would collude with the Pentagon, which is the defense ministry of the United States. And together they would influence the Congress to pass legislation that suited the industry and compelled Pentagon to go in for more and more armament. President Eisenhower called this the military industrial complex, and today it is known simply as the MIC. As Professor Reich points out, Reaganism and the so-called market reforms that were implemented from the 70s onwards have allowed several new types of industrial complexes to emerge. Thus it is that people in America today talk of the medical industry, drug industry complex, the food industry complex, then the insurance industry complex, and so on. Presently, and I have heard some of these debates on the American radio, several American scholars are deeply concerned that Free market capitalism has, like a python, swallowed democracy, allowing freedom to the people once every 4 years when there is election day. Rest of the time the people are nowhere. This is something that scholars are very deeply worried. The so-called market reforms have not remained confined to America. On the contrary, they have spread far and wide, as a result of which humanity as a whole has currently become enmeshed in a range of problems that almost seem intractable. Now, there is a basic reason for all this. If you go upstairs to one of the classrooms, and I have taught in that classroom, there is a little board with a quotation from a French intellectual. I don't know the name of the giant, but he has made a wonderful point, which is that the mind has infinite capacity to deceive itself. That's what he says. And that is very true. Sadly, it is this self-deception that has led to so many problems. Now, it turns out that while the mind is very good at creating problems, it is very poor at solving problems that it has created. And the only way to solve the problem is to raise the problem to a higher dimension and seek solutions there. Now, this is often done in mathematics. You deal with a problem in n dimensions, you find it's insoluble. You go to n plus 1 or n plus 3 or n plus 5 dimensions, you get more space and it becomes easier to disentangle and solve the problem. And so it turns out to be in this case also, provided the higher dimension you are going to include the heart. So slowly I am bringing in spirituality through the back door, having softened you and made you go to sleep. In other words, problems can be solved only when the head and the heart come together, with of course the head leading. I concede that prima facie it might not appear obvious that problems become solvable if you take to a higher dimension. So to convince you, I am now going to quote Bhagavan Baba, the founder of this institute, who often used to talk to students in this very room and draw their attention to a wonderful analogy between a living human body and a healthy society, a correspondence that holds at every level from the micro to the macro. Bhagavan would start from the fact that if the cell is the basic building block of the body, so is the individual in the case of the society. Packed between the micro and the macro, in both cases, are several levels or layers of increasing complexity. In the body, one level above the cell, you have organs like the kidney, the heart, the pancreas, and so on. So it is in the society. We have institutions like the school, the hospital, the police station, the court, the bank, and so on and so forth. Just as the organs work properly only if the cells do, so also the hospital, school, etc. function efficiently only when their staff work in the right spirit. One step higher in the body, there are diverse systems like the respiratory system, the digestive system, the circulatory system, the nervous system, skeletal system, and so on and so on. Society too has many systems like the educational system, the financial system, the administrative system, the judicial system, and so on. At the system level again, functional integrity is a must both in the body and in society. Most important of all, like a living body, society too also can be regarded as a living society. That's why we use terms like a sick society, a healthy society, and all that. Because implicitly we believe society also has something like a life. Now, the only difference is the human body has been created by a God, if you believe there is a God, I do, and society has been created by humans. But otherwise, there is a one-to-one correspondence, as mathematicians would say. At the operational level, the analogy is quite pertinent for a number of reasons. Firstly, despite the enormous complexity of the body, every cell knows exactly what it has to do. There is no question about it. I don't know how it knows, but it knows. And Baba says this is happening because the human genome is encoded to act in a certain way. Not only that, it has to act in the same way as all the other corresponding cells and in a selfless and totally selfless manner without expecting any rewards. That is very important. And Swami says, in the human being, there is a divine spark within all beings, even though they may deny it, which entails them to act in a similar manner in society. So there is a correspondence between the divine spark in the human being and the human genome, which controls the whole functioning of the body. So all we have to do is to copy the operating system in the body and transfer it to society, because there is a one-to-one correspondence. Now, a simple example is enough to appreciate how all the organs and systems in a human body work in perfect coordination in relation to the macro objective. Let us say there is a sprinter who is participating in a 100-meter dash. Obviously, the sprinter has to take off and run as fast as possible. Now, even as the competitor is running fast, the skeletal system, the muscular system, the respiratory system, circulatory system, all act in a highly coordinated as well as synergetic manner, so that the person functions properly in the race and maybe wins the gold medal. Swami says that such synergy and coordination are solely the result of a well-structured and embedded operating system, to which I made a reference. The most important point about this operating system in the human body is that at every level there is an upward responsibility, there is a downward responsibility, and there is no selfishness at all level. If the cells take care of the body takes care of the cell by taking rest, by eating nourishing food, by doing exercise, and doing breathing exercises and so on. So there is a social contract upwards with upwards and downwards responsibility, perfect harmony and total absence of selfishness and swartham and swaprayojanam, as Swami used to call it. So all we have to do is to copy that in human society, and then we are fine. Now, Baba's recommendation make perfect sense at the academic level, but at the working level, all skeptics say this would not work. What is their argument? Their argument is greed and selfishness are intrinsic to human beings, and that is so because they have inherited from lower species, all of which have to fight for survival. Now, what these people are essentially saying is that humans and human society are also bound by Darwinism, that is the principle of survival of the fittest. I don't agree with this. In fact, I emphatically disagree with this conclusion. If humans accept social and market Darwinism as the governing principle for the evolution of human society and civilization, then it amounts to the very negation of the essence of human nature, human values, and humanness itself. On the other hand, history shows that social, cultural, and philosophical evolution have always been in the direction of honesty, integrity, truth, righteousness, justice, fair play, rights balanced by comparable responsibilities, constitutional law, service, compassion, and so on. As Swami often used to tell us, being civilized meant becoming refined in all respects, especially in the spiritual dimension. By that yardstick, adoption of raw Darwinism as the guiding principle for society would be a highly retrograde step backwards, and unfortunately that is what is being recommended by many people. Much can be said on human values and humanness, but I shall not. Instead, I will offer you a favorite quote of mine, which comes from late Professor Weisskopf, an eminent physicist who, among other things, served as a distinguished professor in the prestigious MIT in Boston. Weisskopf said, addressing the National Academy for the Advancement of Science in America, he said, human existence is based upon two pillars. Human existence is based upon two pillars. What are those two pillars? Compassion and knowledge. And Weisskopf adds, compassion without knowledge is ineffective. If a villager is compassionate, there is not much he can do. But knowledge without compassion is inhumane. You can be very clever, but you can also be a devil, because you are not bound by any moral boundaries. Weisskopf was born in Austria and studied physics under great German masters. Even as he was shaping up as a great physicist, he had to run away to America to escape from Hitler because he was a Jew. World War II broke out, and he was in America. He found himself in the Manhattan Project, which developed the atom bomb, and Weisskopf made very important contributions to the concept and the design of some critical systems in the bomb. But after the war, he became disgusted by the bomb and turned absolutely pacifist. That was when he made the observation that I quoted, and that observation says it all. Now, Weisskopf was a scientist, and therefore he was concerned about the dangers of unfettered knowledge, knowledge that is not bounded by morality. And you see that happening in many of the science-based industries. Extending the argument, I would say that market mechanics must likewise be blended with human qualities if the aberrations we are now witnessing are to be avoided. Now, economists are fond of quoting Adam Smith and how, although it is individual selfishness that drives the market, at the macro level it all transforms. There is an alchemy, it transforms to some kind of a benign altruism. I shall offer a quote to say that this doesn't work when you look at it very closely. And in my view, the present and in the present context, market must bow to dharma explicitly because it's absolute. But unfortunately, in today's climate, many people are not ready to accept this. Now, to substantiate my remark that even in the West people are worried about the issues that I am raising, I am going to quote Harvard scholar and philosopher Michael Sandel. And this quote is taken from one of the lectures that he delivered over the BBC as a part of the Wright lectures, Lord Wright, who established BBC, and these lectures were delivered in 2009. Here's what Professor Sandel says. There is now a widespread sense that markets have become detached from fundamental values, that we need to reconnect markets and values. But how? Well, it depends on what you think has gone wrong. Some say the problem is greed, which led to irresponsible risk-taking. If that is right, the challenge is to rein in greed, to shore up values of responsibility and trust, integrity and fair dealing, to appeal in short to personal virtues as a remedy to market values that have run amok. We might call this diagnosis the greed critique, but the greed critique is flawed or at best partial. Markets have always run on self-interest. From the standpoint of economics, there is no real difference between self-interest and greed. Greed is a vice in personal relation, but the whole point of markets is to turn this vice into an instrument of public good. This is the moral alchemy that markets are set to perform. We learn this from Adam Smith, who said it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, Smith said, but to their self-love. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. Professor Sandel continues. So it's tempting to say that all we need to do is to rein in greed and restore integrity among bankers and business executives and politicians. But this response is mainly hortatory, comforting for a time, but not really much help in rethinking the role that markets play in our societies. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is to rethink the reach of the markets into spheres of life where they don't belong. We need a public debate about what it means to keep markets in that place. And to have this debate, we have to think through the moral limits of markets. We need to recognize that there are some things that money can't buy, and there are other things that money can buy but should not. So that is what he said. So you see, even Professor Sandel accepts that the moral alchemy which devotees of Adam Smith rely on and swear by does not drop like manna from heaven. There is a chemistry involved there. Now, Professor Sandel takes us up to a point and leaves it there. It does not show the road further. Mercifully, thousands of years earlier, this country has explicitly indicated how market and morality must be brought together. And that is what I am going to now talk about. Let me make a brief reference to integrity and character because everybody is talking about it these days. They talk about it, but at the same time, ostrich-like, they refuse to accept that virtues like integrity and character are born out of morality. And it is this refusal to accept the moral roots that has led to moral values and morality as a whole being sidelined and even harshly dismissed as irrelevant and obscurantes. Values are intrinsic to human nature because humans have a conscience within which they can cognize and listen to. Thus it is that love, sacrifice, compassion, and the desire to help have all existed from prehistoric times, long before the rise of institutionalized religions. To claim that all is fair in love, war, and the marketplace is a distortion of truth and a false dogma. False dogmas may sound great, appear to be true and convenient to believe in, but untruth will always perish even if it takes time. I would like at this point to remind the audience about the fact that the founding fathers of our republic gave us Satyameva Jayate as the national motto. And yet, do we ever mention the word Satya in our schools and colleges and explain how Satya is the very life breath of the nation? Do we realize that the wheel in our flag represents Dharma? Was that wheel put in the flag merely as a decoration? or to remind us that Dharma was the very essence of life? It is interesting that Jawaharlal Nehru was an agnostic, went out of the way to ensure that some of the new roads built in Delhi after independence were named Satya Marg, Niti Marg, Shanti Path, and so on. The actions of our founding fathers and of Nehru were no accident. Rather, they reflect an ancient tradition to which Swami often made copious reference. Back in those times, I am talking of ancient times, the individual was mandated to govern his or her life according to a fourfold code of conduct known as Purushartha. The Purushartha required every individual to base all thoughts, words, and deeds entirely and unwaveringly on Dharma. This did not mean that individuals were expected to wear sackcloth and ashes and live like monks. No. Oh, they were permitted to acquire wealth and give way to enjoy desires, but within the framework of Dharma. Alongside, as they aged, they were also asked to sublimate their desires and seek God. So there were boundaries at to extent, and humans had to function within these firewalls. And all this was nothing but a code word for moral balance, which was accepted as a way of life for all. Sure, not all were perfect, but the majority were, and that was what led to stability in society. Now, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is well known for many of his contributions in economics, once identified 3 problems as being very important in today's context. 1, conflict, violence, and terrorism. 2, climate change. And 3, mass poverty. Today, we can identify many more, starting with consumption. Now, once upon a time, America was the gold standard in terms of standard of life. Now, today, many other people are trying to catch up with that standard of life. Chandran Nair, who lives in Hong Kong, has written a book called Consumptionomics. And in that he analyzes and says very clearly, it is a stupid mistake for India and China to imitate America, because there are not enough raw material in this world, in this planet Earth, to sustain that level. We are asking for trouble. And consumption economics means winner takes all with little left for the losers, which by the way is what all free market advocates seek most unabashedly. Now, if you allow for this, then there will be inequity with all its unwanted consequences. I won't go into all the details, but I would like to make a mention to how technology controls our life. We don't realize it. We have reached a stage where in many acts of daily life, even very powerful leaders have very little control. Just to give an example, about a year or so ago, in one day, within a space of half an hour, the New York Stock Exchange dropped 700 points. Nobody could say what it was. Ultimately, it was traced to the fact that 3 or 4 supercomputers belonging to 3 or 4 powerful investment bankers were competing against each other. So technology was taking over. And this is not new. During the Cold War, when Russia and America had thousands of missiles, each with many nuclear weapons, megaton weapons, poised against each other, the total war was supposed to be over within 40 minutes, that's all. And many of these systems are programmed to work on auto mode. You get the radar signal, you just launch. It is very dangerous. Luckily, the Cold War fizzled out and people have withdrawn from that brink. But the mindset of humans to become slaves to machines continues. And that is very dangerous. The time has therefore come to pause, reflect, and reconnect actively with moral roots which are within. Now, since I will wind up in 5 minutes, but since this meeting is taking place just after Shivaratri, I think it's appropriate for me to end with a few pertinent remarks on sacrifice. You will recall that one of the stories associated with Shiva is that when the Devas and Asuras were churning the Kshirosagar or ocean of milk so that Amrit, the elixir of life, would come out, what came out very first was Hala Hala, the deadly poison. Nobody knew what to do with it. It was deadly. And Shiva appeared. He scooped the poison in the palm of his hand and swallowed it. And of course, it's got stuck here, which gave him the blue throat. So, Shiva undertook an act of supreme sacrifice. And it is in adoration of this supreme act of sacrifice that Shiva is also known as Tyagaraja, or the king of sacrifice. Tyaga or sacrifice cannot exist without love and compassion. And we know this from Swami. In this context, Swami has compared the birth of a calf and a human baby. When a cow delivers a calf, Within a minute, the calf is able to stand up and drink milk, while the cow licks the baby clean. In the case of a human baby, unless the mother picks up the baby and feeds it, the baby will go hungry. But all mothers do it, because every mother has undergone difficulty for 9 months to give birth to that baby. That is the bond of love and compassion. It is encoded in us. How can we say moral values are not within us? It is falsehood. So, in turn, as the baby grows, it is taught to respect its mother and look after her mother, his or her mother in old age. This is where rights and responsibilities get beautifully blended and balanced. Swami used to say that every individual has not one mother but 4 mothers. So what kind of a count is that? He explained. The first mother is the mother who gives birth to the body. The second mother is the cow, because even after the child has been weaned off drinking mother from its milk, it grows by drinking cow's milk. Third, planet Earth sustains us. It is the third mother. And spiritual knowledge is the fourth mother, Vedas as used to say. So we have really 4 mothers we have to pay homage to, look after and sustain. In summary, if society appears to have got derailed in recent times, there is good reason for it, which is that we are trying to build a super skyscraper without foundation. The only foundation that can truly sustain society is morality. And we should stop trashing morality and decouple compassion from worldly knowledge and so on. We must not allow rights to eclipse responsibility, and we have no business to complain if things go wrong. I shall end by going back to self-regulation, which the market and the media are so fond of trumpeting and claiming all the time. Now one appreciates what they are asking for. In the words of Rajaji, what they want is freedom from permit license Raj, which is a claim that is perfectly valid. I support it. But that does not mean that we should fail to understand what self-regulation means. You see, in spiritual philosophy, there are 2 selves. One is the lower self, which is wrapped up in ego and body consciousness, or Dehabhimanam, as Swami used to refer to it. And then there is the higher self, or the real self, or Atma, call it what you will, which is totally free from Swartham and Swaprayojanam, or selfishness and self-interest. It is that self that must regulate us, not the ego self. But you and I are not Mahatmas, so we will find it very difficult to get regulated by that. So what we do is follow the guidelines laid down, simple rules, and the Purushartha is the simplest of the rules, which says before you do anything, make sure it is locked on to and aligned to Dharma. If you do that, you are okay. And that in brief is what I have been trying to tell you all along. Whether I have succeeded or not, I do not know. But I have done my job, and I hope I did it reasonably well. Thank you for your patience. And Professor Balachandran, I have kept to my time.